Welcome to Defining Dad Bod, where my dad, Coach Alex Van Houten, plus his 14 years of experience to work for you. You should listen to him. Here's Pretty Beast Mode. Who knows who we could be if we could become 1% better every single day.
What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing super well. You're listening to Season 3, Episode 31 of Defining Dad Bod, where we're talking about carbs. Turns out, they're not so bad, just misunderstood, and I'm looking forward to clearing that up with you today. This episode's been sponsored by our Better Daily group. Everyone has a cross to carry, but it's lighter when you don't do it alone. Join us at betterdaily.disciplemedia.com. The web community is filled with amazing people who encourage you on your health and fitness endeavors, and it's filled with amazing resources that will inspire and instruct you when it comes to making exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle change. Right now is an awesome time to join because we're just a few days in to the Spring Faithful 40 Challenge. You can jump right into the challenge today and start making progress on your goals. Jump in now at betterdaily.disciplemedia.com and save $20 on your first 2 months of membership with the coupon code FAITHFUL40. betterdaily.disciplemedia.com. Our food for thought today comes from a conversation that I had with a health coaching client recently. She's relatively new to my roster, and so this was our first official coaching conversation. We were talking about her past history of getting activity in a day. You know, if you have a step tracker, counting your steps. She said that in the past, she would do well for a while getting her steps, but then something would get injured, like her foot or her knee or even her back, and it would set her back for a while. She said, I know the 10,000 steps a day thing is good, but it just doesn't seem like my body can hold up to it right now. I asked if she was walking on a treadmill, or if she was pacing her house or going outside, and she said with a big smile, No, I go outside and take my walking buddy for a walk. I asked her if the side that she keeps injuring is the same side that she's holding her dog on. Since this was a Zoom call, I could see her face change, and suddenly all the light switches flipped on. Holy crap, she said, is walking my dog hurting my foot? After a bit more conversation, we came to the conclusion that her having to stomp on that side while trying to pull that dog back a little bit might actually be the key to helping her body enjoy walking. You see, from a biomechanics perspective, the natural gait and swing of your arms is impeded significantly when you're trying to hold a leash on one side, especially if that dog's a little rambunctious. And while holding a dog leash for a few minutes won't make a big difference, if you're doing it for most of your 10,000 steps in a day, for most of your days in a year, that sort of impact and misalignment definitely adds up. A short time later, she reported getting a pinch collar for the dog, training it to heel better, and noticing that her feet, her knees, and her back were holding up really well to her new walking regimen. My food for thought for you today is this. In many of the clients that I've worked with, limiting beliefs about what their body, their mind, or even their metabolism is capable of often comes from one or two tiny, seemingly insignificant details that could really change everything. See, it's a big deal to change this belief. I can't walk very often because it's not good for my body, and I'm just going to end up injured. To a different belief, if I put in the time and effort into training my dog so that he doesn't pull on me, then not only can I walk more often, but I can keep enjoying it with my walking buddy. And hey, I'll do it without injuries. I had a similar experience with a completely different client, where we found that the key to decreasing her neck pain and her frequent headaches was found in regularly stretching her jaw. I know it sounds weird, but it changed her life in like 2 days. What limiting beliefs are keeping you from making the changes that you know you need to make? And is it possible that there's just a few details within those beliefs that could change everything? If walking hurts, maybe you need to wear some better shoes. If your dog pulls a lot, maybe you need to train that sucker. Your neck shouldn't hurt all the time, and you shouldn't get regular headaches. Maybe there's something you're eating, or even more simply, a stretch you need to perform to significantly improve your quality of life. I'd love to know what your pain points are and what you think you can do about them. Shoot me a message at coachal@definingdadbod.com. That's your food for thought today. I hope it gives you something to munch on. Now, without further ado, let's talk about carbs and why they're so misunderstood. Carbohydrates. probably one of the most hotly contested macronutrients out there. And I mean, there's only 3 of them: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, so that's not exactly claiming a gold star victory. But chances are, no matter what you do for a living, no matter how often you exercise, no matter what you're doing from a diet perspective, you've had a run-in with the word carbohydrates. And today, my goal is to help you understand what a carbohydrate actually is, what its properties are, what it might do for your body in a positive way, what it could do in a negative way, and then I hope to tie up the conversation by explaining a little bit about how I coach carbohydrates with my clients who have body composition, performance, or health goals. Since this is a hotly contested topic, worth hours and hours and hours of research, evaluation, and conversation, I plan to keep this conversation informative and practical, but I want you to know that it's by no means exhaustive. I'll be referencing other episodes of Defining Dad Bod here as well, since I have covered several of these topics related to carbohydrates, just in a different place. You'll find those links in the show notes below. Before we get to what they do in the body, or even how we handle them in programming since they have such a bad rap among most people, let's talk about what carbohydrates actually are. Carbohydrates are one of the 3 macronutrients. As I mentioned earlier, there are fats, also known as lipids. There are proteins, which are long chains of amino acids tied together. And then there are carbohydrates. There are many classes of carbohydrates, specifically polysaccharides, disaccharides, and monosaccharides. And if you're a chemistry geek like I am, you can go look those up and see how those molecules all fit together and what makes them different from fatty acids, which make up fats, and amino acids, which make up proteins. What makes carbohydrates one of the most interesting points of contention, however, is actually a relatively easy property to understand that's tied up in the molecule. Now, I say it's an easy property to understand, but I'm going to give you a little bit of leeway if you don't understand it yet, because I studied organic chemistry for several years, and I've been in the personal training industry for a while, and it wasn't until about 10 years into my career that I understood molecularly what differentiated carbohydrates from fats, that they might affect our body differently. In order to understand this, though, I've got to take you back to 6th grade or 7th grade biology. Remember when you were learning about the cell? That was the basic building block of life, right? And the cell was wrapped in what's called a lipid bilayer, or a membrane, and inside of the cell were organelles, a bunch of different pieces of machinery that let the cell operate appropriately. You might remember words like endoplasmic reticulum, nucleus, or lysosome. One particular organelle is extremely important among all of the others, because its job is to supply the cell with the energy required to power the cell to do life-enhancing and life-propagating things. That organelle is called your mitochondria. You might have heard it called the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria's job is to take raw materials and then, through a complex set of chemical reactions across the membrane of the mitochondria, to synthesize what we call ATP. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the molecule in your body that stores the energy that you use to power all of the chemical reactions that happen in your body. On this show specifically, we've talked about things like epigenetics, which is the turning on of certain genetic alleles to bring about changes at the level of the cell. The turning on, quote-unquote, of genes requires ATP to power that activity. On this show also, we've talked about exercise, which is consciously and intentionally putting your body through strenuous motions in order to create cellular adaptations. When you do a bicep curl and your muscle tissue shortens with actin-myosin filaments interacting with each other, that reaction is also powered by ATP. And if I haven't lost you yet with all this science speak, the neurons that are firing in your brain to try to remember this and try to make sense of what I'm saying to you is also powered by ATP. So you see, all of the energy and activity of your life centers around the function of the mitochondria in every single one of your cells. Now, what in the world does this have to do with carbohydrates, Alex? One more piece of information you need to understand, and I'll stop throwing science at you hard and fast, is that mitochondria create ATP by using oxygen to coax electrons to move very fast over the membrane of the organelle. Without oxygen, the mitochondria cannot produce ATP because there's nothing forcing the electrons to move across the membrane of the organelle. I'll relate this to a real-life example. Over Christmas, Gabriel got a remote control excavator from his grandpa. Ironically, it's actually really hard to drive that thing well, and took me a while to figure the controls out. But just like anything that takes batteries, when we opened the box, we had to go get a screwdriver and open up the battery panel. It took some double A's, and I showed Gabriel how to match up the plus side and the minus side, and explained to him that the excavator would not turn on unless we had these lined up right. "Why is that, Dad?" he asked. Then I explained to him that the battery was storing an amazing amount of an energy molecule called an electron. And the electron is what made his little remote control excavator work. But if the electron did not shoot across the excavator in the right direction, then the excavator would not be able to turn on. So it's very important that we put the battery in the right position so that the one side of the battery can suck the electrons from the other side of the battery all the way through the excavator. Now, if you're a physicist or chemist listening to this, you're probably pulling your hair out right now. I understand that was a very simple explanation of electronegativity. But many people don't know that just like the battery in the excavator, the same thing is happening at the level of the mitochondria in your cell. And oxygen is the molecule that drives the electron action potential across the mitochondria to create ATP. If you don't take anything else away from what I just said, hear this. Without oxygen, you cannot create adenosine triphosphate. Without adenosine triphosphate, no reactions happen in the body. Thanks for the biology lesson. I appreciate it. Now I can go help my middle schooler with his homework, Alex. But what the heck does this have to do with carbohydrates? And now we come to the rub. Well, carbohydrates and fats differ in the body in a bunch of different ways. The primary difference between the energy that comes from carbohydrates and the energy that comes from fats is that fats have no oxygen in the molecule itself. It requires that your body breathes in oxygen, then translates that oxygen into the bloodstream, then pumps that oxygen throughout the body, and then transfuses that oxygen from the bloodstream to the individual cells where they can be used at the level of the mitochondria to create ATP. Carbs, on the other hand, have oxygen built into the molecule. Where fats require your body to provide the oxygen, carbohydrates can make it all the way to the cell, all the way down to the mitochondria, and power the reaction all by themselves, without requiring the body to move oxygen there first. And for this reason, every individual human being has an attribute that we've called in the scientific community metabolic flexibility. That is the ability to use carbohydrates or fats and to switch between them when the situation requires them. In sports science, we call this the different energy systems. You've probably heard that a marathon runner uses primarily fats as a fuel source. We're requiring carbohydrates just to keep the blood sugar stable, whereas a 400-meter sprinter uses almost exclusively carbohydrates and creatine phosphate in order to complete their activity. One activity is a long-duration sport, requiring the body to move lots of oxygen to the cells to make good use of the efficiency of using fat as a fuel source, whereas the other activity is a short-duration activity. The cells in the body are able to just use the carbohydrate stores that are available to churn out that level of work at a very high intensity because it's not limited by how much oxygen is able to get to the cells. So ideally, every human body would be capable of smoothly transitioning between the usage of fat as a fuel source and carbohydrates as a fuel source, depending on the demand of the situation. We'll talk about this more later, but the vast majority of people who come to work with me for body composition goals specifically actually have to start in the phases of training that reteach their body how to use fat as a fuel source. This lack of metabolic inflexibility comes from a mixture of poor eating habits, coupled with some genetic factors, and a lack of exercise in the presence of excessive carbohydrate consumption. In short, you don't need short-term fuel stores if you're not doing anything intense on a regular basis. And so if you're eating carbohydrates all the time and not exercising regularly, then your body can easily become lazy with the whole fat burn thing and become more and more conditioned to relying on carbohydrates while sparing your fat stores. More on that later when we talk about how we periodize carbohydrates. For now, a recap so far. Carbohydrates are one of the 3 macronutrients, and carbs and fats are utilized at the level of the mitochondria in order to create the energy that you run on, living a high-quantity, high-quality life. Carbs are easier for the body to use for energy because they have an oxygen molecule built right into them. And overconsumption of carbohydrates, especially in the presence of certain genetic factors, poor lifestyle habits, and lack of exercise, can cause the body to become adapted to relying on carbohydrates and sparing fat rather than using it. So now we have a handle on what carbohydrates actually are and why they're different from fats. Let's talk about how they might interact with the body outside of simple energy production. In addition to being an important short-term energy source that provides oxygen within every molecule of a carbohydrate, carbohydrates also affect the digestive system. When you eat carbohydrates, they begin breaking down as soon as you start chewing them. There are several enzymes in your saliva, one of them specifically is called amylase. In the process of chewing and mixing your carbohydrate with saliva begins the breakdown process of carbohydrates. Ultimately, your larger carbohydrates, polysaccharides and disaccharides, are broken down into single individual pieces called monosaccharides. And those monosaccharides are either transported directly into the bloodstream or they're metabolized by some of the bugs in your gut and other enzymes later on. The two primary monosaccharides that your body uses in order to create that energy we were talking about earlier are glucose and fructose. And most digestible carbohydrates are made up of those in a long chain fashion that until each link of the chain is broken, they can't make it to the bloodstream. So again, that process as you start to chew your oatmeal as an example begins in your mouth, then slides down your esophagus to your stomach. Harsher enzymes and hydrochloric acid continue the process, and most of the carbohydrates that you eat are broken down and then transported into the bloodstream from the stomach right there. Once carbohydrates are in the bloodstream, they've taken the form of glucose. And at this point, we measure this glucose in terms of blood sugar. After eating carbohydrates, they break down in your mouth all the way to the stomach, and then your blood sugar starts to rise as a result. We'll talk more about blood sugar in just a second, but you should also note that there are other carbohydrates in your food that don't get transported into the bloodstream at the level of the stomach. Instead, they continue on through the digestive system, either because they're resistant to your enzymes, or because the chains of carbohydrates are so long that they don't have time to fully break down in the stomach before they move on. Now, these carbohydrates are generally referred to as fibers or starches. And what's really powerful about these is that once they make it out of the stomach and even the small intestine, they can be used to feed bacterial colonies in your body and your large intestine. So the fiber and the starches promote proper motility, meaning the speed of the food passing through the system, and certain carbohydrates can make it all the way to the gut flora of your body. And there they can feed or promote positive bacterial colonies while also feeding the lining of the digestive system. One study I read recently while battling a potential colitis flare-up was about resistant starches. Those resistant starches are starches that make it all the way to our large intestine, but can still be broken down by the bacterial colonies there. 3 sources I found to be particularly interesting were green bananas. That is, bananas before they've gotten the opportunity to ripen, which is why green bananas taste less like sugar than a very ripe banana. It's an acquired taste, but those starches might make it all the way to your large intestine and feed some great bacteria for you. Also, cold white rice, the real stuff, not the processed stuff that's been boiled for hours and hours and hours, the stuff that takes a little while to cook, and cold cooked potatoes can also be a source of resistant starch. After you've cooked your rice or after you've cooked your potatoes, you refrigerate those, and the starch molecules that have been broken apart actually reform together upon refrigeration and make a longer chain starch that will make it all the way to your large intestine as well. We can talk more about that on another day if you're interested, but for now just know that even before carbohydrates make it to the level of your cell, they act on your digestive system by regulating motility, that is the speed your food moves through your system, by feeding bacterial colonies, and by providing energy to the lining of the digestive system so that it can repair itself. Another function carbohydrates have on the body that not many people talk about with regard to carbs and fats is that carbohydrates can also create changes in neurotransmitters in the brain. We're not really sure of the mechanism entirely. It might be the rising blood sugar, it might be signals sent from the small and large intestine, specifically the bacterial colonies that make it all the way to our brain, or it might simply be tasting carbohydrates that does it itself. But carbohydrates seem to have an effect specifically on serotonin and dopamine in the brain, and thus actually might play a role in self-regulating mood with food. And you know this to be true. Think about it. When you're really stressed at work, or you've had a really long day, are you hankering for an avocado, or do blueberry muffins become irresistible? Or when you're on a really long drive, and you're going to be in a car for a while, and you want to pick me up, you don't feel like snacking on spinach leaves, do you? You want chips, candy, or even a sugary energy drink. Regulating these neurotransmitters is extremely important to your body, and your brain's not stupid. One of the fastest fixes when serotonin and dopamine take a plunge and make you feel a little garbagey is to reach for a comfort food. Salty, sweet, crunchy. Your mind has associated those textures and those tastes with something that's very capable of boosting your mood. A fun side note, serotonin as a neurotransmitter seems to be directly related to the status of ourselves within our community. They've done studies at weddings, for instance, to check the serotonin levels of the couple that's getting married and the family members and guests present. Serotonin rises among all people attending the wedding, but the serotonin rises highest in the bride and groom and in the parents of the bride and groom. Presumably, the ceremony itself, at least for a brief period, elevates the status of the bride and groom and their respective families in their community. Notably, we tend to like to eat cake at weddings, which would further elevate the serotonin level in both the wedding party and the guests. And similar findings have been found with birthday parties as well. Imagine the strangeness of a world where for your birthday, instead of giving cake to everybody to share the serotonin, you fed everybody a salad. I'm not saying we should do that, but the absurdity of that helps you understand to what level we have used carbohydrates to regulate our mood and even our status and the status of our guests through dopamine and serotonin. It's just not quite a party without cake now, is it? Now we've said a lot of things so far, so let's make sure we're all tracking. Carbohydrates are a short-term fuel source because of the oxygen that each molecule of carbohydrates carries with it to the level of the cell. Carbohydrates can also influence our digestive system, both through resistant starches and fiber, to influence how things work and recover around there. And carbohydrates can also influence our brain, specifically as seen in the cases of serotonin and dopamine, and thus can easily become what we call comfort foods, used to regulate mood, rather than to fuel the body or aid digestion. Carbs get a bad rap. Why is that? There are a lot of reasons carbs get a bad rap. Let's walk through them together. The first and most important reason, in my opinion, that carbohydrates get a bad rap is because the huge abundance of ultra-processed foods in the standard American diet. As the world becomes more and more industrialized, and people come to expect their food to cost less and less while being more and more convenient, you find that the vast majority of food available for purchase in somewhere like a grocery store or even a convenience store is going to be an ultra-processed, prepackaged food. What does this have to do with carbohydrates? Well, do you remember when we were talking about the size of the carbohydrate molecule? How a polysaccharide, a large molecule of carbohydrate, is made up of much smaller pieces, like chain links making up a chain. When you make a Twinkie or a potato chip, and you expose the starches of the founding materials, like ground up wheat in the case of Twinkies, or thinly sliced potatoes in the case of potato chips, when you expose those starches, those carbohydrates, to very high levels of heat for an extended period of time, and several different chemical processes and ingredients that increase the shelf life of those foods, by default, what happens is you take the very long chain polysaccharides that are in the food itself and chop it up into much smaller pieces. Hey, what does it matter, Alex? Carbs are carbs. They're all going to turn into glucose, right? Well, yes, on one hand, you're right. But on the other hand, the question is, how quickly do ultra-processed foods turn into the sugar that gets into our bloodstream? And it turns out that ultra-processed foods significantly increase the glycemic index of the food substance that it was made out of. For instance, a piece of whole wheat toast has a very different glycemic index than ultra-processed baking flour. So the fundamental building blocks of a Twinkie and a piece of whole wheat toast are exactly the same thing. The carbohydrates in one hit us much differently at the level of the gut and the bloodstream than the other. And so right now in the nutrition sciences, when we're looking at things like carb to fat ratios and protein ratios and tracking positive health and positive body composition outcomes for patients and subjects, what we find is often those studies treat all carbohydrates as if they're created equal. The grams of carbohydrates coming from your Skittles and Twinkies holding roughly the same value numerically as the grams of carbohydrates coming from your wheat toast. We'll talk more about carbohydrate periodization in a little bit, but one of the ways that we overcome the misconceptions about carbohydrates as a whole is the same way that we overcome the misconceptions about calories as a whole. Not all carbs are created equal, and similarly, not all calories are created equal. In addition to the vast amounts of ultra-processed carbohydrates that you can find available at your grocery store, convenience store, or even fast food joints, you'll also note that many of those ultra-processed products also have a significant amount of simple sugars and even low-quality fats added to the product itself. And so you can get foods like Twinkies, which I'll keep picking on, that in a relatively small volume of the food, one Twinkie equaling about 130 calories, you can pack 24 grams of carbohydrates, 5 grams of fat, and about half a gram of protein into that tiny little thing, whereas a normal yellow squash cooked in a little bit of butter would be about 10 grams of carbohydrates, 4 grams of fat, and 1 gram of protein. Not only is there a significant caloric difference between the ultra-processed Twinkie and the minimally processed yellow squash, the carbohydrate composition is different. Because the Twinkie's ultra-processed, those carbohydrates break down quickly and easily and end up in your bloodstream much faster. Whereas the carbohydrates from your squash take a much longer time to break down because they're longer chain. And in fact, some of those starches might actually make it to the large intestine, where it can feed some good bacteria, some healthy starches, rather than passing undigested sugar onto your large intestine, feeding the toxic gas-producing microbiota that ultra-processed foods tend to feed. So while you're considering carbohydrates in your diet, don't lump your fruits and veggies in with your ultra-processed foods. Another reason carbs get a bad rap is that a lack of exercise and proper conditioning of the body leads to all sorts of issues with carbohydrate regulation. I call it the chocolate milk problem, and I cover this in full in episode 117 of Defining Dad Bod if you're interested. The take-home message is, if you are athletically conditioned, it's very likely that not only are you insulin sensitive enough to handle sugar, but you're also regularly using your glycogen stores. And so your capacity to consume carbohydrates without any negative health or body composition effects is much higher than the average person. Carbs often get a bad rap because somebody just starting a weight loss journey or a workout program might try to feed themselves like an athlete is recommended to feed themselves. And that's not going to work out very well for you. If you're not using your glycogen stores well, you're not burning fat well as a fuel source, and you're a bit insulin resistant. Like I said, if you want to hear more about that, go to episode 117, where I tackle the sugar problem. Another reason carbs get a bad rap is related to the same issue. That is, the cortisol and insulin dysregulation that's related to weight gain and a sedentary lifestyle. Remember when we talked about carbohydrates hitting the bloodstream? We talked about the amount of glucose in the bloodstream going up. What I saved till now to talk about is the relationship between the hormone insulin, which is produced by your pancreas, and the hormone cortisol, which is produced by your adrenal glands. Insulin does a number of things in the body, but one of its most important functions is to signal fat cells to tell them whether or not to keep releasing fat to be used as fuel or to turn off fat burn altogether. It also signals other cells in the body, like muscle cells, organ cells, and even nervous system cells, to use sugar as a fuel source when there's large amounts of sugar available in the bloodstream. And so if you couple a sedentary lifestyle, which is a lifestyle that's not using carbohydrates very often in the form of intense exercise, and therefore finds people with large amounts of glycogen, so your carbs really have nowhere to go but into your fat storage, and you add a few pounds to somebody so that there's more cells inside of them to respond to insulin, then the body protects itself from diabetic shock by automatically desensitizing the cells in your body to insulin itself. And so carbs get a bad rap because when somebody has more weight on them than they should, and they're not exercising regularly like they could, then they find themselves in a downward spiral of increasing insulin resistance and increasing dependence on carbohydrates to be burned as fuel in the body. I know that's a lot to take in. If you want to get deeper into those subjects, then check out episode 30 where I speak specifically about insulin's job in the body, and episode 40 where I speak specifically about cortisol and its relationship to insulin. Carbs wouldn't get such a bad rap if people understood how activity and a healthy body composition allow the body to use both carbohydrates and fats as fuel sources, even without following a quote low-carb diet. Another thing we can't go without saying here is that carbs often get a bad rap because it's the only macronutrient that human beings can technically live without. If a person goes without protein for too long, their body's unable to find any other way to do the job that protein's supposed to do in the body. The same thing happens to be true of fats in the body. If a person was to cut out fat completely from their diet, there are a number of systems and processes that would suffer so badly that they would be unable to keep living unless they added fats back in. But that's not the case with carbohydrates. From a biological perspective, carbohydrates lend specifically energy to the body. And it turns out that both fats and proteins can be utilized as energy in the body in place of carbohydrates if they're not available. There's a process called ketogenesis, wherein the body can utilize ketones instead of carbohydrates to power those reactions we talked about in the mitochondria. And so without carbohydrates, fats can stand in just fine on the energy side of things. And similarly, if it's necessary at a biological level, the body can also turn amino acids into glucose using a process called gluconeogenesis. Some very passionate, and I'm sure well-meaning individuals have thus suggested that carbohydrates are completely unnecessary. And since human beings are capable of subsisting on the modern-day equivalent of whale blubber and steak, then that's what everybody should be doing. And while a debate on how omnivorous human beings were in the past, and perhaps should be now in the present, would be a lot of fun, this isn't the place for it. For now, I just want you to know that this is one of the reasons that carbs get a bad rap. Technically, you don't need them to survive. Whether or not that means you never get another piece of carrot cake in order to manifest your best in this life, in my mind, that's a completely different question. For my part, unless you've got a medical issue that requires that you cut out carbohydrates completely, I'm going to say that surviving is not quite the same thing as thriving. And we'll leave it at that at the moment. Hang with me. I've got just a few more reasons why carbs get a bad rap that I think are really important. Kind of riding on the coattails of the idea that we can technically live without carbohydrates. If you dive into the meta-analysis done on carbohydrates and fats and positive outcomes for patients, clients, and subjects in research, then what you find is we really don't know what the optimal ratios of carbs, fats, and proteins are in somebody's day for positive body composition outcomes, performance outcomes, or health outcomes. I covered a very specific and comprehensive article in episode 93 of Defining Dad Bod. It's titled, Should You Eat Less Carbs or Not? The Science of the Great Carbs versus Fats Debate, and what we do and don't know in the scientific community about how many carbs you should be eating versus how many fats you should be eating would surprise you. I'd encourage you to go check that out. The last two reasons I believe carbs get a bad rap in my purview is a lack of understanding around 1, genetics and epigenetics, and 2, our microbiome. In episode 126 of Defining Dad Bod, part 4 of the TrueFit series, I did my best to explain epigenetics well. And the idea of different genetic heritages requiring different nutrient profiles is also something I've brought up multiple times in the show. Long story short, it's very likely that some people do much better than other people on a relatively high carbohydrate diet, while there are other people who do much better in their lives with a relatively low carbohydrate diet. Our genetic makeup can influence our insulin sensitivity. It can influence how we break down carbohydrates and the different enzymes we produce in differing amounts. It can influence the muscle fibers that we have on our body and what types burn fat primarily as a fuel source versus carbs primarily as a fuel source and how much of it we have on us. And genetic factors also influence personality traits that could be involved in the regulation of things like serotonin and dopamine, as we spoke about before. Until these interactions are well mapped out, I wish I could tell you more specifically what alleles, genetically speaking, predispose people to do better with more carbohydrates or worse with more carbohydrates. But unfortunately, that science is murky at best. But we all understand anecdotally that we have that one friend that seems to be able to eat however much pizza they want and never gain a pound. While we have that other friend, and maybe it's us, that just looks at a cupcake and then stores it on their love handles. I know, it's not quite fair, but I don't make the rules. I'm just telling you like it is. And so that brings me to our microbiome, which the more I learn about it, the more fascinated and interested I become. Basically, all of the food that you eat passes through your digestive system and is not only broken down by the enzymes and the mechanical processes that go on in your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, and your small and large intestines, but that food is also processed or broken down by billions and billions of bacterial colonies that live inside of you. It turns out that different bacterial colonies are more efficient than other bacterial colonies at breaking down carbohydrates. Additionally, some byproducts of the bacterial colonies we feed could have negative repercussions on our neurotransmitters in our brain and perhaps even insulin sensitivity. What I'm telling you is that one of the reasons carbs get a bad rap is because when we lump them all together under carbohydrates, we miss out on the differentiation of how certain carbohydrate sources are feeding our bacterial colonies well and causing positive repercussions over time, whereas some of those sources of carbohydrates that we simply call carbs are influencing our gut bacteria in a bad way and causing negative repercussions on our body over time. And it's not just all the processed crap either. For most everybody else, black beans would be a very powerful nutrient source. However, in some individuals with certain bacterial colonies, the fiber in black beans is metabolized to create large amounts of hydrogen sulfide gas, which is not only embarrassing when it comes out the other side, #rotten egg gas, but hydrogen sulfide gas can also be damaging to the gut lining itself, which over time can cause inflammatory issues and even permanent damage. Am I saying you shouldn't eat black beans? No, not really, although I know I shouldn't. But what I am saying is carbs get a very bad rap because we don't understand our microbiome as well as we should, and we lump all carbohydrates into the same category, simply labeled carbs, when the carbs from oatmeal, the carbs from black beans, the carbs from a green banana versus a banana with some brown spots on it, they all have vastly different effects on the microbiome of our body. And as a population, we simply know next to nothing about it. With all that being said, I'm sure you're gathering by now that I'm not one of your anti-carbohydrate zealots. However, carbohydrates enter my conversations very often with my clients, both because of these misconceptions and because of the importance of coaching these intelligently in order to bring about long-term body composition change. So how do we handle all these factors at Defining Dad Bod? Well, there's a number of things we do, and I hope this is really helpful to you, so listen close. First, from a training perspective, we like to periodize our carbohydrates. Periodize sounds like a fancy word. What it really means is that there are phases of training that require lower carbohydrate intake to get more positive adaptations, and other phases of training that require higher carbohydrate intake in order to get the best positive adaptations out of ourselves. I've referenced this concept often when I talk about training acute variables and when I talk about preparing for the holidays intelligently. Basically, during the foundations and endurance phases of training, I often recommend clients to have a lower carbohydrate intake. Depending on the person, 20 to 40% of their calories in a day coming from carbohydrates is usually fantastic. Also, as I've alluded to earlier, the sources of carbohydrates are extremely important. Generally, we focus on those long-chain polysaccharides, good resistant starches, and some solid fiber sources to keep the carbohydrates that are in our life nice and low on the glycemic index and supporting a healthy gut at the same time. Oh man, I can hear you saying, 20 to 40% of my calories from carbohydrates? That leaves no room for Oreos. No, it really doesn't. And honestly, if you're going to look for a dirty source of carbohydrates, pick something better than Oreos, man. Hashtag peach cobbler for life. But it's not all gloom and doom. In the higher intensity phases of training, like hypertrophy, strength, and athleticism, consumption of carbohydrates is often better, higher. For many of my clients, this means somewhere between 40 and 60, sometimes 70% of their calories coming from carbohydrates. And we even strategize how a high carbohydrate, perhaps even processed carbohydrate meal will do better on our high volume, high intensity days. This is where you've heard me say, if you're going to have carrot cake, have it on leg day. I could be more specific and say, if you're going to have carrot cake, make sure it's on leg day in the hypertrophy, strength, or athleticism phase. This periodized carbohydrate intake profile is extremely important to me as a fitness professional for two reasons. One, there is a small body of evidence around metabolic flexibility that suggests if you cut carbohydrates completely out of your life, then you start to lose your ability to metabolize them well. This might be one of the problems with people who go low carb for a period of time to try to hit their weight loss goal. And then when they're happy with the weight that they've hit, they try to add those things back in. Well, losing weight by cutting calories and carbohydrates does not make you any better at processing carbohydrates. It just forces you not to use them as a fuel for a while. And then when you add them back in, your body doesn't know what to do with them. And so it stores them again. And that might be a gross oversimplification of the science, but there you have it. The second reason it's important to me as a coach to periodize carbohydrates, I know this for myself, clients are much happier when they don't have to limit carbohydrates all the time. I speak often on this show about balancing the quality of your life and the quantity of your life. And frankly, it's nice that there are some phases of training that I can put my body through that makes a French toast date with my son on a Friday morning a positive thing in my training cycle, rather than a negative thing in my training cycle. In short, periodizing carbohydrates is based on the philosophy, don't avoid carbs, earn them. So when you're exercising at a low intensity, in the lower intensity phases of training, your body will do just fine running off of mostly fat as a fuel source. But in the higher intensity phases of training, when you're actually using carbohydrates regularly, having built a solid foundation for yourself in the lower intensity phases of training, then you are regularly earning carbohydrates in your day. And when you eat them, especially from high quality sources, your body's going to use them well. And this periodized carbohydrate profile is related to the next thing we do in coaching, which is planning our, quote, cheat meals. Now, I'll probably do a show on cheat meals altogether, all by itself. Technically, I hate the word cheat. The reason is that I generally help people plan their, quote, cheat meals. And so if you make those things a part of the plan, then it's not a cheat. But I would advise you that even if you're not working with a coach, if you know you're going on a date with your wife, and it's going to be a particularly high calorie, likely molten chocolate cake sort of meal, then make sure your workout program coincides with some sort of high-intensity interval training, or large muscle groups like quads, hamstrings, and glutes, or lats, lower traps, so that the load of your workout program, 1, depletes your glycogen stores, and 2, primes your body for the anabolic effect of the workout itself. Carbs can actually enhance the adaptations that come from a high-intensity exercise program, and so you'll be making great use of that fuel, rather than just cheating on your diet in a way that was kind of factored into the caloric need of the week. Also, you get to walk away feeling like a winner who had a great workout that day and hopefully a great date. The last thing we navigate in coaching here at Defining Dad Bod is probably one of the things that sets us very apart from other coaching programs, and that is the development of other emotional regulation strategies that are not food related, that'll help our clients get off of carbohydrates as a serotonin and dopamine modulator. Again, maybe this is worth a show all by itself, but things like periodized exercise, gratitude, goal, or anxiety journaling, fasting, prayer and meditation, music, and even intentional communication in relationships can all be powerful skills that you could develop to manage your emotional regulation of dopamine and serotonin better. I've heard clients say things like, I don't know why I did that. I wasn't even hungry, but I felt sort of like I was rewarding myself for a really hard day. Or, I don't know what to tell you, Alex, but even after a 1,000 calorie dinner, I still feel hungry afterward. But I notice it's not in my stomach, it's in my head. And I believe this sort of thing in the year 2020 is an extremely important component of somebody's nutrition and exercise program. It's one thing to have a meal plan. It's another thing to have food journaling expectations and to work on habits. But it's something completely different to begin bringing awareness to how often we're regulating our own emotions with the food that we eat. And since there's no shortage of ultra-processed carbohydrate stuff for us to drown our sorrows in, I believe it's important for modern-day people to develop the skills to regulate their own emotions outside of food. And those skills allow us to make intelligent decisions about periodizing carbohydrates, our carbohydrate sources, and enjoying some of the pleasures of life every once in a while, like cake on your birthday. I think that about wraps up the carbohydrate conversation. I'm looking forward to covering fats and proteins with you soon. This has been Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names. The free, practical advice and conversations here remain unbought and unbiased, thanks to the support of Better Daily. If this episode has been helpful to you, share it with someone in your life who you know it will benefit. Then, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a raving review to tell others what value Defining Dad Bod has brought to your health and fitness journey. Finally, if you're struggling for betterment, don't do it alone. We all have a cross to carry, and it's lighter when we do it together. Go to definingdadbod.com/betterdaily to get supported, challenged, and inspired to take yourself to the next level. Who knows who we could be if we could become 1% better every single day. Go to definingdadbod.com/betterdaily today. That's definingdadbod.com/betterdaily.